Right now, there might be a glass in your hand, beer, wine, or just the vague thought that in a little while you'll pour one. You think that's your choice tonight. But that choice was made for you a long time ago. 10 million years ago, by a creature that wasn't even human yet. On the floor of a forest in Africa, a small primate picked up a piece of fruit that had been sitting on the ground for too long, and it ate that fruit. The fruit had fermented. Inside it, there was alcohol. And what happened next inside that little animal is still happening inside you. Every time you raise a glass, even tonight, you think you're beginning something very human, very modern. A habit of bars, of dinner tables, of glass bottles with labels on them. You're wrong about that. You are continuing something older than writing, older than farming, older than your species itself. The question isn't when humans started to enjoy alcohol. The question is, how long ago was that craving already sitting inside your body? And the answer is going to change the way you look at the glass in your hand tonight. Let's go back to that rotting fruit on the forest floor. When a piece of fruit falls from a tree and lands on the ground, it doesn't just sit there. The natural sugars inside it start to break down. Wild yeast in the air lands on it. And a quiet process begins, one we call fermentation. Fermentation, put simply, is just yeast eating sugar and giving off alcohol. And that alcohol is what makes rotting fruit smell faintly of something sharp. And that smell, to a hungry primate, was a signal, because the smell of alcohol meant sugar. Sugar meant energy. Energy meant survival. That was the argument of a biologist at the University of California, Berkeley, named Robert Dudley. In 2014, he published a book with a title that almost sounds like a joke, The Drunken Monkey. His idea was simple. Our ancestors didn't stumble onto alcohol by accident. They were drawn to it. That slightly pungent smell of overripe fruit was a signpost pointing straight to the richest, most calorie-dense meal in the forest. The animal ate that fruit. It felt a little lightheaded. It had no idea why. But the feeling was pleasant, and its belly was full. So it came back, the next day, and the day after. For millions of years. But if the story stopped at a theory about behavior, it would still be fragile. Being drawn to a smell doesn't prove anything on its own. The real question is this. Did the bodies of our ancestors actually change because of that smell? They did, and this is where it gets astonishing. In 2015, a scientist named Matthew Carrigan and his colleagues published a study in the journal PNAS. They traced back a gene called ADH4. It sounds complicated, but you don't need to remember the name. You only need to know that ADH4 is the blueprint for an enzyme in your liver, and that enzyme is the exact thing breaking down the alcohol in your body right now. Yes, right now. Carrigan and his team reconstructed the ancient version of this gene in our ancestors. And they found something. About 10 million years ago, a single mutation appeared. Just one small change. But it let the enzyme in our ancestors' livers process alcohol nearly 40 times faster than before. Sit with that number for a second. Nearly 40 times. And its timing was no accident. 10 million years ago is exactly when our ancestors began coming down from the trees and living on the ground. And what's on the ground? Fallen fruit. Fruit that has been sitting there, fruit that has fermented. Whoever could digest that alcohol could eat a source of food that everyone else had to leave behind. So here's the first fact that might stop you in your tracks. Your craving for alcohol is not a bad habit you picked up from society. It didn't begin in adulthood, at a party, under some pressure from friends. It was written into the DNA of your family line 10 million years ago, back when your ancestors weren't even standing upright. The taste was already there. It was just sitting there, waiting. But being lured toward the accidental alcohol of nature is one thing. Making it on purpose is something else entirely. And that was the real leap. When did humans manage to do that? The answer is far older than you'd guess. In 2018, archaeologists were excavating a cave near Haifa. The cave is called Raqefet. It had once been used by a group of people called the Natufians about 13,000 years ago. Inside, they found stone mortars carved directly into the bedrock. Not loose stones brought in, carved straight into the rock of the cave itself. An archaeologist at Stanford University named Li Lu analyzed the residue left inside those mortars. And what she found was the trace of a process. Not grain to be eaten. Grain that had been sprouted, then ground, then left to ferment. Those are the 3 steps of brewing beer. The first is called malting, which just means letting the grain sprout to wake up the sugars inside it. Then grinding. Then letting wild yeast turn that sugar into alcohol. The Natufians did all 3 of those things in a cave 13,000 years ago. And here's what makes this discovery so important that it almost turns everything upside down. The Natufians were not farmers. They had not invented agriculture. They were still gathering wild grain by hand and hunting animals for meat. They did not grow the barley. They found it. But somehow, turning that little bit of wild grain into beer mattered enough that they worked out this complicated process before they knew how to plant a single seed. And that cave, Raqefet, was not a home. It was a burial place, which means that beer wasn't a way to get through the day. It was tied to death, to ritual, to sending someone off. Do you see the problem here yet? For generations, the story was told one way. Humans settle down. Then they farm. Then they build villages. And then, much later, they stumble onto fermentation and start to drink. In that version, alcohol is the reward that comes last, a luxury that only a settled civilization has time to think about. Raqefet says the opposite. These people were brewing while they were still nomadic, while they still had no fixed home. Alcohol didn't come last. It was there from the very beginning, and if a small group would go to that much trouble just to have beer, then imagine what happens when it's not one group but an entire region that wants to drink together in one place. About 1,000 years after Raqefet, in what is now southeastern Turkey, something enormous was built. We call the place Gobekli Tepe, massive stone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, arranged in careful circles carved with images of animals. The whole thing was deliberate, and it was built before agriculture, before pottery, before anyone in the region had a permanent place to live. The people who built it were still hunter-gatherers. Try to picture that. You're a group of people with no oxen, no pulleys, no wheel, and somehow you organize enough labor to drag 10-ton blocks of stone up a hill and carve them with precision. What could make people do that before they even had a clear reason to stay in one spot? The answer may lie in the stone vats found here. Large ones, some holding up to 160 liters. When researchers analyzed the crust on the walls of those vats, part of it tested positive for calcium oxalate. That's a compound that forms when you soak, grind, and ferment grain. In other words, the fingerprint of brewing. Not a few drops. Enough for large gatherings. The current theory goes like this. Gobekli Tepe was not a place to live. It was a meeting place. People came from across the region, gathered here, performed rituals, and drank together. But I'm going to be honest with you here because it matters. That oxalate evidence is still preliminary. It only came back partly positive, and there are archaeologists who don't buy it. They say those stone vats might have just been for storing grain, and whatever was inside fermented by accident with nobody ever meaning to brew beer at all. So I'll leave this question open. Deliberate fermentation vats, or just a pantry that happened to go boozy on its own? To this day, nobody's certain. What do you think? I actually want to hear it. But whatever the answer is, it leads straight to a bigger question, one that archaeologists have argued about for decades. Why did humans start farming? The obvious answer is for food, for bread, to stop being hungry. But there's one man who spent his whole life pushing back on that obvious answer. His name is Patrick McGovern. He is the leading expert on ancient alcohol in the world. And his argument, which he has defended for decades, goes like this. Humans may not have domesticated grain to make bread. They domesticated it to make beer. It sounds strange at first, but listen to his reasoning. Bread takes a lot of steps. You have to grind the grain into flour, knead it, then bake it. And baking needs controlled fire and a hot surface. It's a fussy process. Beer is simpler. You let the grain sprout, soak it in water, and leave it alone. Wild yeast finds its way in. The fermentation happens by itself. You barely have to do anything but wait. And now ask yourself honestly, which is the stronger motivation? The desire to have one more form of grain slightly changed to chew on? Or the desire for that warm, floating feeling your ancestors had been chasing for 10 million years? McGovern believes the answer was always obvious. And the physical evidence gets more precise as we move further down the timeline. By about 7000 BCE, in a Neolithic village called Jiahu in central China, McGovern and his colleagues analyzed the residue in pottery jars. What they found was not some crude brew. It was a blend fermented from rice, honey, grapes, and hawthorn berries. Multiple ingredients chosen and combined on purpose. Whoever made this knew exactly what they were doing. This was not luck. This was a recipe. Then humans began to write it down. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians didn't just drink beer. They gave it its own goddess, named Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. And there is a hymn to Ninkasi, written around 1800 BCE, that many people consider the oldest recorded beer recipe we know of, though scholars still argue over whether it's a true recipe or simply a poem. Let that sink in for a second. One of the earliest pieces of human writing was not a law, not an epic. It was instructions for how to brew a batch of beer. If McGovern is right, then the conclusion is very specific, and it flips everything you were ever taught. Alcohol was not a reward humans gave themselves after they had built the world. It may have been one of the reasons they started building it in the first place. And once beer was at the center, it stopped being just a drink. It became almost everything. Go to Egypt. The laborers who built the great monuments were paid in beer. About 4 to 5 liters a day. That was their real wage. Not coins, not gold, beer. And no, before the thought even reaches you, that beer was not cold. No refrigeration, no ice in the middle of the desert. It was warm, thick, the consistency of a loose, yeasty porridge, and people still fought to be paid in it. If you were dragging stone under a sun that peels your skin, and someone offered you a choice between a bag of coins and a few liters of that warm beer porridge, I suspect you'd choose exactly what they chose. Because that beer didn't just make you lightheaded. It was thick enough to be a meal. It gave calories, nutrients, the fullness you needed to keep hauling stone. Beer wasn't just a drink, beer was lunch. But here I have to stop and correct something people often say carelessly about ancient beer. You'll often hear that people drank beer because it was cleaner than water, because water was filthy and killed you. That's not entirely true. And saying it that way skips over a more interesting fact. Beer was not some magic filter that turned dirty water safe. The truth is that in the brewing process, the water was heated when the grain was mashed, and that heating killed off some of the pathogens. On top of that, the mild alcohol and the fermented environment made it harder for bacteria to survive. And most importantly, people still drank plain water when they had clean water. Beer didn't replace water. It was just the safer option in the places and moments when water couldn't be trusted. Then there's the medicine side, and this is where it gets genuinely hard to believe. Researchers once analyzed the bones of ancient people in Nubia, south of Egypt, who lived around 1,500 years ago. In their bones, scientists found tetracycline. Tetracycline is an antibiotic. A real antibiotic in the same family as the ones a doctor still prescribes to you today. Where did it come from? Almost certainly from beer. The grain they brewed had been colonized by a strain of soil bacteria that naturally produces antibiotics. And that antibiotic went into the batch, and then into their bodies. Let this number land. These people were drinking antibiotics in their beer more than 1,500 years before the modern world invented antibiotics. They had no idea why that beer helped them stay well. They only knew that it worked. So a single cup of beer was, all at once, doing the job of a paycheck. A meal, a medicine, and a prayer, offered up to the gods. And if by now you still think this is the story of one strip of land, of Middle Easterners, and then Egyptians passing a habit hand to hand, then let me take you halfway around the world. To South America. To the Wari people in what is now Peru, a little over 1,000 years ago. On a mountaintop fortress called Cerro Baul, archaeologists found a brewery. Not a single vat. An entire workshop capable of brewing batches of up to 1,800 liters at a time. What they made was chicha, a kind of beer made from corn and the berries of the Peruvian pepper tree. And the brewers, based on the evidence left behind, were all women. The Wari elite gathered here to drink, and to do politics, to forge alliances, to arrange power. When they finally decided to abandon the place, they did something almost sacred. They brewed one last batch, drank it down, smashed their ceremonial cups, and set the whole brewery on fire. This is the part worth stopping on. The Wari had never heard of the Natufians, never knew of Egypt, Sumer, or Jiahu. They were on a completely separate continent, half a world away, and they found alcohol on their own. In some other parts of the Americas, people even chewed corn in their mouths and spat it out, because saliva has something in it that turns starch into fermentable sugar. Nobody taught them that. They worked it out themselves. Do you see what this means? If alcohol were only a cultural invention, a trick passed from one tribe to the next, then it could not have appeared independently in places that had never met. But it did. In Africa, in the Middle East, in East Asia, and in the Americas. 4 places arriving at the same thing without ever agreeing to. That's not a habit that spread. That's a biological pull, repeating itself everywhere humans set foot. The same smell of rotting fruit that lured our primate ancestors now led humans, on every continent, to find their way to the same answer on their own. So let's tie the whole story together. 10 million years ago, a mutation in your ancestors' livers let them digest the alcohol in rotting fruit, and that taste was carved into their bloodline forever. 13,000 years ago, humans brewed beer in a cave where they buried their dead before they knew how to plant a single seed. 12,000 years ago, they may have built the first monument in history just to have a place to drink together. 9,000 years ago, they had a blended recipe. And on both shores of an ocean that nobody had ever crossed, humans reached for the very same thing on their own. Alcohol did not come after we built the world we live in. There's a real chance it was one of the first reasons we started building it at all. Tonight, you think the glass in your hand is your choice. It was never yours. The small primate that picked up a piece of rotting fruit on a forest floor 10 million years ago made the choice for you. You are just the first creature that learned how to make it on purpose.